Finally, we're to the design step. And this is what, when people think of applied behavioral science, this is often what they think about. They think about this design process by which we're developing interventions or potential interventions that change behavior. Often, in a modern context, people are doing that based on insights that are drawn from the lab, right? This is the sort of encyclopedia of biases approach or the nudges approach. The idea is that things have worked elsewhere, or we have insights about how people interact from elsewhere, and we will port them into the environment. Now, I've explained in previous parts of this course why I think that's dangerous, why it has problems, why the replication crisis and other things make that sort of a risky proposition to say, well, it worked elsewhere, it will work here. But this is sort of the hallmark step that people are really used to when they think of applied behavioral science. So what makes the design step so different in the SIDE method compared to how sometimes people do applied behavioral science? Well, the really big difference here is going to be a focus on pressures and on connecting the designs that we propose, the interventions that we may create, to those pressures. Why is this so important? Well, because what happens often is, people get the strategy part right. They articulate a behavior, maybe even a behavioral statement. Then they go through some insights phase. They get an understanding of why people act the way they do in the world today. And then they sort of set that aside and say, well, this is contextual. It helps us understand the space. Now we're free to just start brainstorming ways to change behavior. We do not change behavior directly. So when we design things, we don't design for behavior change, we design for pressure change. And then pressure causes behavior to be more or less likely. By changing the balance of pressures, we are changing the outcome or the probability, remember, probabilistic, not deterministic, outcome of a behavior. This is really important, and it's really different than what happens in a lot of processes in design thinking or other places. Why is this connection between pressures and interventions so important? Well, a lot of times people do what I think of as epiphany-based design. So even if they do research, contextual research to understand the space, they just start generating ideas, but they don't know where those ideas came from. They're not sure why they're good ideas. They just start suggesting things. Now, a lot of people who are used to traditional design will say, well, have a lot of experience. I've been doing this for a long time. I know what good looks like. So when I come up with an idea, I don't know where it came from. It came from my own creative sense, but I know what good looks like. What we want to do in applied behavioral science is step away from that idea, that bias, that our own ideas are good because we came up with them or because we're experienced. Ideas are good because they're clearly connected to the pressures that come before them. How does this help us? Well, what it does is create a through line of evidence so that when we start to test things, we are able to actually improve iteratively because we know why we tested something. So let's imagine that I brainstorm an idea for changing a pressure and then I go on and test it. If it doesn't work, I now am able to say, well, here's where that design came from. It came from my understanding of this pressure. Do I need to go back and look at my evidence for this pressure? Maybe that pressure isn't the way that I thought it was. Or maybe the pressure is what I thought it was, but the design that I came up with didn't actually modify the pressure. We'll get into, in the next lesson, that evaluation lesson, the E of the SIDE side part, how we might debug all of these things. But the foundation of that really lies here in design. If we just start brainstorming interventions coming from our own creative power, we won't be able to debug. We won't be able to create this through line of evidence that opens up the black box of design, that allows us to say, hey, if this doesn't work, I'm going to fail forward. I'm going to learn something from that. I'm going to be able to debug. We want every pilot to teach us something. Right? Now, that doesn't mean design isn't creative. It doesn't mean there isn't a role of experience. And it is true that as people do this over the years, as you get to be a behavioral designer and you have lots of iterations of this, you may have a whole bank of interesting ideas to start from that you could connect to those pressures. You may have seen things that work elsewhere that might work in this context, right? You have all sorts of things that come in to this process. It's very creative, but it's based on evidence. I don't want people to get the idea that creativity and evidence are enemies. Instead, evidence helps us be more creative. It gives us more jumping off points, and it helps us understand why things work so that we can iterate forward. Now, when you come into the design step, you're coming just out of the insights phase. So you've already got a pressure map. Hopefully that pressure map is tied with impact, confidence, and likelihood to change, right? You have some sense of what's going on. Now, here comes the really key flip between this and other brainstorming sort of methodologies. You're really going to take things one pressure at a time. So rather than trying to brainstorm all the ways to change behavior, you want to take a single pressure and say, hey, what are all the ways I can strengthen or weaken this pressure? So we're going to really have a pressure-based lens on our iteration.